美好生活节，摄像地板、木门、墙板空间解决方案，天成聚国潮，1元惠万家。
飞利浦健康空调57度高温除菌，飞利浦空调打造健康新标杆。
脖子酸、手臂麻、脑袋晕、肩背痛，可能是颈椎病。颈椎病得吃药，颈富康纯中药，专注治颈椎病。治疗颈椎病，颈富康可以。颈富康药业，请按药品说明书或在药师指导下购买和使用。
王守义13香，说得好不如做得好。华彬快消品，社会责任铸就健康品牌。
脖子酸、手臂麻、脑袋晕、肩背痛，可能是颈椎病。颈椎病得吃药，颈富康纯中药，专注治颈椎病。治疗颈椎病，颈富康可以。颈富康药业，请按药品说明书或在药师指导下购买和使用。装修后多久住新家
？3棵树马上住，8小时定位住新家。
装修咱选3棵树，北京2022年冬奥会官方涂料独家供应商。
中国3棵树，健康马上住。王守义13香，说得好不如做得好。
我是吴京，我坚信一方水土养一方人。今天，更多中国宝宝和飞鹤奶粉、飞鹤新飞帆轮，还有健康和食品卫生间覆盖9大关键词，飞鹤奶粉高端销量遥遥领先。
那么它会有这个消费信心提升了，那么有车了，那么就会有选择去出游。那么我想旅游业也会在这个汽车行业这个强力的复苏的前提下得到很快的一个恢复。
那我们再来看一份数据，1至5月新能源乘用车的批售是189.2万辆，同比增长117.4%。5月的纯电动车批售是32.4万辆，同比增长96.3%。插电混动车的批售是9.8万辆，同比增长184.4%。这些数据有没有超过您的预期呢？您觉得这番数据的背后传递出了哪些积极的信号？
为什么在今年的数据里边，我们看到无论是乘用车还是商用车的这个终端销售都出现某种程度的下降，但是新能源车在这个
又吹向陽光，季風氣候嘅下，雨熱同季，滋養萬物嘅效率高，發生災害嘅概率亦大，莫不為利，莫不為害，所以季風。 象更迭需要依據規律，循規守常，要講求信。春之得風，風不信，其華不盛；夏之得暑，暑不信，其土不肥；秋之得雨，雨不信，其谷不堅；冬之得寒，寒不信，其地不乾。亦即係話，該熱嘅時候就熱，該冷嘅時候就冷。不當至而至為有餘，該至而未至為不足。不足固然無益，有餘同樣無量。可能喺記載異常氣象現象特別影響嘅時候，將佢哋統稱為
Someone like him who's been in combat,
I think understands that very well. He's also a genuinely decent and good human being, and I think he will go into that action with a good attitude. On the other hand, I like the fact that you separate out the two issues you just mentioned, the South China Sea and Taiwan, because I think they actually show the kind of nuance we need in how we try to work together, the United States and China. On Taiwan, as you point out, for China, this is a sovereignty issue. For the United States, this is a solidarity issue with an important democracy that we've been friends with for 40 years. Both sides have very important interests, and we just have to prevent that problem from ever becoming a war. There is just an absolute requirement that we not allow Taiwan, an important but small island of 23 million people, to produce World War III. It would not be, I'm not saying it would be Taiwan's fault, but that issue cannot be allowed to bring the U.S. and China into World War III. And so I think the key is to keep looking for ways to mitigate the issue, to calm the issue, to let time be our ally, instead of trying to force the issue at any given moment.
About the South China Sea issue, China, many experts in the field have pointed out that they noticed the U.S. is trying to let China's neighbors stand in line and trying at this moment to create an ambience in which the U.S. military strength could be moved from the West Pacific to what the U.S. called the Indo-Pacific region and to the South China Sea, and also trying to seek in disguise the opportunity to create military bases in Southeast Asia, which of course China's neighborhood. As you may know, two big powers, when they are becoming ever more closer militarily, geographically, that's going to be very, very dangerous. So now, Mr. O'Hanlon, how do you see the U.S. should do to reduce the concerns coming from China that the U.S. is trying to create a circling against China militarily through the issue of the so-called South China Sea?
Yes, it's a very good question. There are a few things that I would recommend. One is that in our rhetoric, we should acknowledge that China is not involved in some huge arms race, because China is still spending less than 2% of its gross domestic product on its military. And we spend more than 3% of our GDP on our military. So yes, China's making a lot of investments because China has a lot of economic and scientific power. And that is going to cause concern among American strategists, but we should not necessarily view it as an unfriendly action by China. China has more power. China is going to develop more power. I understand that.
Mr. O'Hanlon, another strategic concern coming from not only China but also neighbors in the region, at least from China's perspective, is that those countries are being forced to stand in line while they are reluctant. For example, Singaporean Prime Minister have been talking very specifically about the Asia-Pacific region rather than using the phrase of Indo-Pacific. That, to a certain extent, already show quite some attitude, at least about out not willing to stand in line. Meanwhile, you also see even countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and some of the others participating in the economic framework that the U.S. tried to establish in the region, and yet reluctant to stand in line in terms of so-called security issues. So how do you see Shangri-La dialogue, which is taking place in the region, would be able to give some balance to all these discussions?
So let's take the Belt and Road Initiative, if we could, to start with that, because a lot of American strategists get very worried about that. And my response is usually to say, listen, if we think that China is doing too much in the region, maybe we should do more and give some of the countries in the region some choices, and they can see where they get the best economic opportunity. Because I think the BRI, I'm not an economist, but when I read accounts of the BRI, in some places it's doing a lot of good. In other places it may be creating too much debt for countries. And so I think countries need the choice to be able to evaluate a Chinese offer on BRI for their own interests. And so, for example, in some of Southeast Asia, maybe Indonesia, BRI may be good, but BRI might have proposed an expensive concept for Pakistan or Malaysia that led those countries to say, no, we need a different concept. That's a perfectly good debate. And I think the best way for the United States to enter that debate is not to object to BRI, because BRI can do some good things. Instead, we should be helping countries in the region evaluate specific Chinese proposals and determine if those BRI proposals are good for them or not. And if they don't like those BRI proposals, maybe we can offer an alternative. This could be sort of a friendly competition.
Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institutions in the U.S. Next, my conversation with Senior Colonel Joe Bo, former director of the Center for Security Cooperation with the Chinese Ministry of National Defense.
Zoom in on global affairs with insightful debates and exclusive interviews. This is World Insight.
Welcome back. Our focus today is the Shangri-La dialogue ongoing this week in Singapore. Next, my exclusive interview with Senior Colonel Joe Bo, former director of the Center for Security Cooperation with the Chinese Ministry of Defense. The issue of Taiwan, it's very much China's bottom line. From China's perspective, how do you see the U.S. recent rhetorics and actions?
Well, I have certainly taken notice that Biden, quote-unquote, got for the third time on Taiwan issue during his visit in This is alarming to China in that all the previous government have maintained that this issue of Taiwan being part of one China issue, although the White House has quickly walked back to his comment to say that the U.S. will still stick to its one China policy. But such kind of remarks coming from the U.S. president for the third time is certainly something unusual. So I'm wondering whether the United States is actually changing its one China policy gradually, or if it still talk about one China policy, is it only a kind of lip service, or just by adding something else in it, it is actually making one China policy following up?
Strategic ambiguity has always been the key phrase from the U.S. side. Now, Senior Colonel Joe, do you see that has been evolving?
Well, that is a good question, because ever since Richard Nixon visited China, American policy towards the Taiwan Strait has been one of the strategic ambiguity. That being said, it will not say for sure whether it would send forces or not should there be a war across the strait. But now we see a kind of strategic clarity, which was initially championed by scholars like Richard Haas. But this debate, even domestically speaking in the United States, didn't win much popularity. Because there are some other people like Bonnie Glaser who would argue that should you make it clarified, maybe it would just accelerate mainland determination to use force against the Taiwan. So it's up to them to decide which term they want to use, be it clarity or ambiguity. But whatever it is, it would not affect the police determination. in using force as a last resort if, for example, the three conditions laid out in the anti-secession laws were exhausted.
What are these conditions, just for those who are not experts on the day-to-day development of the issue?
Well, basically, China has expressed that it has utmost sincerity to reach a peaceful reunification with Taiwan, but non-peaceful means would have to be employed in three conditions. Number one, Taiwan is declared independence, which I believe is not possible because they know that surely might a military response from mainland. The second thing is, should some major incidents which lead to Taiwan being separated from mainland. So we have to wonder what could be this major incidents. For example, the United States is just salami cutting on China's sovereignty. So, for example, Washington Post revealed that the United States actually have been sending troops to train the Taiwanese forces secretly. So all these so-called major incidents. The third condition is that China believes that the possibilities of peaceful reunifications are totally exhausted. So that invites two problems. One is about the ruling party in Taiwan, whether they will still favor this idea of one China. The other thing is, what role is the United States playing in making the mainland to believe that the chances of peaceful reunion is exhausted?
There were mixed messages coming from Washington. The official line is strategic ambiguity and status quo, quote unquote. And yet from Biden, the president himself, there have been some quote unquote personal opinions stating otherwise. Now, earlier, Mr. Hannan commented on that issue. I also want to invite your views on that, Senior Colonel Zhou.
Well, I think this is hard to say whether President Biden was talking about, as all this matters, with a kind of clarity deliberately. So we don't know that. But this is his third time to talk about that. But the other fact is, after he got on Taiwan issue, every time he was walked back by his assistants, by those officials in the White House who insisted that America's one-China policy has not changed. That would not deter our determination to reunify with Taiwan through peaceful means. But at the same time, we have to be prepared for the worst scenario, and that's the job of the people.
I do not want to use the exact quote because the White House officials already walked back on the statements were casual words given by the president. And yet there seems to be indication that the U.S. may use force or military actions if China takes certain actions. Now, that is a very interesting way of saying things. How do you see the different ways that the president of the U.S. is trying to say?
Well, I think whether the U.S. would really send troops to the Taiwan Strait is really a big question, because even according to Taiwan Relation Act, it didn't specify whether the United States would send the troops or not. But I have a very interesting comparison. I look at the situation in Ukraine. From the very beginning, President Biden has alleged that the United States would not send the troops into Ukrainian soil to fight directly with Russian troops. This was reiterated in his opinion, which was published in the New York Times almost a week ago. So my question is, if the United States would not send troops to fight against of the so-called Third World War, why would it become so determined to send troops to Taiwan Strait to fight against the Chinese? Because if you compare China with...
Not to mention that the Taiwan issue China consider as a sovereignty issue.
Yeah, and I know about 181 countries that includes the United States who have diplomatic ties with China consider it to be a domestic issue of China. China's economy is more than 10 times larger than that of Russia, and China's military expenditure is 3 times larger than Russia, and China has more military ships than the United States, and it is said that China has a solid system that could carry nuclear weapons, is much more advanced than U.S. officials would believe, and the conclusion of U.S. that China actually is a more serious long-term threat than Russia. So that means China's defense is much stronger than Russia. So how would the U.S. challenge China militarily while they dare not challenge Russia militarily?
The U.S. is trying to start some kind of a new Cold War against China. I'm sure many have noticed that the speech given by the Secretary of State Blinken a week ago about the so-called U.S. strategy toward China. And yet many say many of those words are being expressed vaguely without, actions are not supporting those words. How do you read the U.S. approach to China now?
Well, I think the Secretary of State Blinken's message has something positive in that he said the United States would not want to have a new Cold War with China. But if you just unfold the whole map, you will see that what the U.S. is doing is counterproductive. For example, the Indo-Pacific strategy that was published in February. Well, what is the focus? Well, it is very clear. And they made it very clear that it is focused on China. So, and if you look at AUKUS, if you look at the Quad, although these two things are different, but the AUKUS is certainly against China, and the Quad is because of China, and the new economic initiative, the so-called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is not inclusive at all, right? With China being excluded. How can this kind of economic framework really succeed? Well, it's up to them to see to work it out unless it becomes successful. But there are so many problems, obviously, there. For example, the best thing all these countries want is access of market. Basically to have more export to American market. But this is not accessible, and it is. Also includes some major economies in the region like China, so I don't believe it will be successful. It is a kind of a good wish, but this is probably wrong number.
Shangri-La Dialogue is taking place this week. One of the key for this event is to bring in opinions coming from defense ministers from the Asia-Pacific states. How is this interaction and discussion among them that could help to bring more possibility for peace and stability in the region? Some have been talking about the issue of South China Sea, whether that would become a thorny issue there. Now, Senior Colonel Zhou, your thoughts?
Basically, people go there to watch how China and the United States fight against each other verbally. So that is why American Secretary of State speech would always be the first one in the first day, and the Chinese defense minister speech would always be the first in the second day. Because in this regard, let me put it another way. If they put the two speeches on in the same day, probably the next day, there would be much less people, watching or reading all this. It would become less interesting. So they always put the two most important speeches on two different days. But this kind of forum definitely would provide a lot of, venues for exchanging views. So apart from all these glittering camera and the conversations, there are, of course, much more quiet bilateral talks, even between China and the United States. So that is where people could actually discuss about things more seriously in many ways. When you talk about South China Sea, that is, of course, is interesting because why? Every time Shangri-La Dialogue will certainly include kind of a topic on maritime issue. China, of course, is heavily involved, but so are those ASEAN countries, and with the so-called freedom of navigation of the United States, also a number of European countries, which appear more and more in this region, definitely this is a useful discussion for all people.
So you don't see that it's going to create further conflict when the U.S. is still trying to figure out whether their actions are going to match their words in terms of not starting a Cold War against China.
The United States today is not what the United States was after the Cold War, because, well, that is alarming. I read American newspapers and I found that actually 1 in 3 people believe it is justifiable to use force against the government. So quite a few books.
아메리게 배유나 중국 당시 담남시 군도기 강야라 동인기 내시나 문시 국제계 소기 내장도 도전동지 아굴사야 나때 만에기 배조 튼줄조에 내시대로 누가 마게네 뭐실라 당시 나견도 외지 달려진다 입에 나라 들면서 민다 거지 누구 대신 민주 제교가 제라 이잖아 슈도